A folded piece of paper, soaked in rain and desperation, sits on a cracked porch step at the edge of Tacoma. Inside the house, a pregnant woman presses her hands against a locked bedroom door, listening for footsteps. She hasn't seen the outside world in 4 months. The note she slipped beneath the front door contains 9 words that will change everything. But the man who finds it isn't a police officer. He isn't a neighbor. He's a Hell's Angel, 6'3", covered in tattoos, riding a machine that shakes the pavement, the kind of man the world tells you to run from. Within 48 hours, 60 motorcycles will line this street, and the man who locked her inside will face something no deadbolt can stop. The house at 1847 Wilson Street sat at the end of a cracked sidewalk in the industrial outskirts of Tacoma, Washington. It was a narrow 2-story structure with chipped blue paint and a porch that sagged on one side like a tired shoulder. The yard was overgrown, the mailbox stuffed with flyers nobody ever collected. To anyone walking past, it looked abandoned, or at least forgotten. But behind the drawn curtains on the second floor, someone was watching. Ruby Whitfield pressed her forehead against the window pane. The glass was cool against her skin, and she could feel the October rain outside trembling through the frame. She was 28 years old, 7 months pregnant, and she had not left this house in nearly 4 months. Her reflection stared back at her, thinner in the face than she remembered, dark circles carved beneath her brown eyes, her auburn hair tangled and unwashed. She placed one hand on her belly and felt the baby kick. A small, fierce life pushing against the walls of its own confinement. She turned from the window and looked at the bedroom door. It was locked from the outside. A deadbolt that Craig Hollister had installed 3 weeks after she told him she was pregnant. He said it was for her safety. He said the neighborhood was dangerous. He said he would take care of everything, and she just needed to stay put. But the lock only turned one way, and Craig had the only key. She crossed the room carefully, stepping around the water-stained patch on the carpet where a leak had gone unrepaired for months. The bedroom had become her entire world, a queen-size mattress on a metal frame, a nightstand with a cracked lamp, a small bathroom adjoining through a narrow door. Craig brought groceries twice a week and left them on the kitchen counter downstairs. He would unlock her door, leave the bags, and lock it again. Sometimes he stayed long enough to tell her things. Things about how no one was looking for her. Things about how her family had stopped calling. Things about how lucky she was. Ruby sat on the edge of the bed and opened the nightstand drawer. Inside was a small notebook she had found wedged between the mattress and the wall when she first started looking for anything she could use. A pen had been harder to find. She discovered one under the bathroom sink, a dried-out ballpoint that still worked if she pressed hard enough. She'd been writing in the notebook for weeks. Not a journal, not letters, just thoughts, fragments, the name she wanted for the baby, the things she would do if she ever walked out the front door again. She did not know exactly when things had changed with Craig. It had not been sudden. It never was. In the beginning he had been attentive, almost too attentive. He wanted to know where she was going, who she was seeing, what she was thinking. She mistook it for devotion. By the time she recognized it for what it was, the walls had already closed in. He isolated her from her sister in Portland. He took her phone. He moved them to this house on the edge of Tacoma, where nobody knew her name. Ruby heard the front door open downstairs. The familiar sound of Craig's boots on the hardwood floor, the jangle of keys. She closed the notebook and slid it back into the drawer. She waited. His footsteps moved through the kitchen. She heard the refrigerator open, the crack of a beer can, then silence. He was sitting in the living room. He did not come upstairs that night. She lay awake in the dark, one hand resting on her belly, listening to the rain. Through the window, she could see a slice of the street below. A streetlight flickered orange across the wet pavement. And then she heard it, a sound she had heard before, but never paid attention to. The deep, rolling thunder of motorcycles. A group of them, maybe 8 or 10, rumbling down Wilson Street like a slow-moving storm. Ruby sat up and looked through the window. She could see them passing under the streetlight, leather vests, bearded faces, chrome catching the rain. They were heading toward the corner bar 3 blocks down, the one Craig had told her was full of criminals and thugs. She watched them until the taillights disappeared, and then she lay back down. But something stayed with her. Not the sound. Not the sight. Something else. They had moved together, not one of them ahead, not one behind. They moved like people who belonged to each other, like people who would not leave someone behind. Ruby stared at the ceiling and placed both hands on her stomach. "We're going to get out of here," she whispered. She did not know how. But the baby kicked, and for the first time in weeks, the silence in the room felt less like a cage and more like a pause, the kind that comes right before something changes. Silas Brennan had been called a lot of things in his 46 years. Criminal, outlaw, thug, monster. He had heard them all, in courtrooms, in newspapers, in the whispered conversations of people who crossed the street when they saw him coming. He stood 6'3" with a shaved head, a greying beard that hung past his collarbone, and arms covered in tattoos that told stories nobody ever bothered to read. He wore a leather vest with patches that most of Tacoma recognized immediately. The winged skull, the name embroidered across the top rocker, Hell's Angels. To the people of this neighborhood, Silas was a warning, a man to avoid, a figure to fear, and he understood that. He had spent most of his adult life building that image, earning it through years of loyalty to the club, through bar fights and road runs and long stretches of silence where the only people who spoke to him were brothers who wore the same patch. He did not expect the world to understand him, and he had stopped caring whether it tried. But there were things the world did not see, things that did not fit the image. Silas Brennan had raised his daughter alone after her mother left when the girl was 4. He had sat in hospital waiting rooms reading children's books to a scared little girl who needed tubes in her ears. He had worked 12-hour shifts at the shipyard to pay for braces and school supplies and a used car when she turned 16. He had walked her down the aisle 2 years ago and cried in front of 60 people who had never seen him show a single emotion. None of that made the papers. None of that fit the headline. The clubhouse sat in a converted warehouse on Pacific Avenue, a few blocks from the waterfront. It smelled like motor oil, cigarette smoke, and the permanent ghost of spilled beer. Inside, the walls were lined with photographs, decades of rides, rallies, brothers who had come and gone. A pool table sat in the center under a hanging light, and a long bar stretched across the back wall. This was where the chapter gathered. 47 members in the Tacoma chapter, though on any given night you might find 15 or 20. Danny Meacham, the vice president, was leaning against the bar when Silas walked in. Danny was shorter, stockier, with a red beard and a scar across his left eyebrow from a wreck on Interstate 5 8 years ago. He had been riding with Silas for over a decade. "You see the news?" Danny said, sliding a beer across the bar. Silas sat down. "I don't watch the news. City Council's talking about us again. Nuisance ordinance. They want to shut down any establishment that serves known gang members." Danny made air quotes around the last 2 words. Silas took a long drink. "We're not a gang. Try telling them that." Silas set the beer down. He had heard this before, the same cycle every few years. Politicians needed something to point at, and men in leather vests made easy targets. It did not matter that half the chapter held steady jobs, that Rick Dutton was a welder who coached Little League, that Jimmy Ackerman had just finished his EMT certification, that the club ran a toy drive every December for children in foster care. None of that made the story simple enough for a headline. "Let them talk," Silas said. "We keep doing what we do." What they did, beyond the rides and the brotherhood, was something the neighborhood never acknowledged publicly but relied on privately. When Mrs. Chen's grocery store on South Tacoma Way was robbed twice in 1 month. It was Silas who parked his bike outside her door every evening for 3 weeks until the problem stopped. When the flooding hit the Hilltop neighborhood last spring, it was the club that showed up with generators and sandbags before the city trucks arrived. When a teenager on the block was being followed home from school by a group of older kids, it was Danny who walked the boy home every afternoon for a month without being asked. These were not acts of charity performed for cameras or applause. They were instincts, the same instinct that made a man who had been abandoned by the world build a family out of strangers. The same instinct that made someone who had been called a monster spend his life quietly protecting people who would never thank him. Silas finished his beer and stood up. It was Thursday night, and the rain had slowed to a drizzle. He would ride home the long way, down Wilkerson Street, past the row of houses that backed up against the rail yard. He liked the quiet of that stretch, the way the streetlights turned the wet asphalt into something that looked almost clean. He did not know that in one of those houses a woman was pressing a pen into a scrap of paper so hard the ink bled through to the other side. He did not know that his life was about to change. But the road was familiar, and the engine beneath him rumbled like a heartbeat, and Silas Brennan rode home the same way he always did, alone, unhurried, and completely unaware that the world was about to ask him a question that no reputation could answer. Ruby had been planning for 11 days. Not the kind of planning that involves maps and schedules and careful logistics, the kind of planning that happens in the mind of someone who has only one chance and knows it. She had noticed something during Craig's last visit, a gap beneath the front door. Not the bedroom door, which sat flush against the carpet, but the front door downstairs, where the old weather stripping had peeled away and left a sliver of space between the bottom of the door and the threshold. A gap just wide enough for a folded piece of paper. The problem was getting downstairs. Craig had changed his routine. He now left her bedroom door unlocked for exactly 20 minutes while he brought groceries in from his truck. He would carry the bags to the kitchen, organize them, and then come back upstairs to lock her in. 20 minutes. That was the window. Ruby tore a page from the notebook and sat on the bathroom floor. She had rehearsed the words in her head so many times they felt carved into her skull. She pressed the pen to the paper and wrote, "My name is Ruby. I am pregnant and locked in this house. 1847 Wilson. The man who lives here will not let me leave. I need help, please. Anyone." She folded the note twice, slipped it into the waistband of her sweatpants and waited. Saturday came. She heard Craig's truck pull into the driveway at 10:30. The front door opened. His boots on the stairs. The click of the deadbolt turning. The door swung open and he stood there holding 2 plastic bags. "Groceries," he said, not looking at her. He turned and walked back down. She listened to his footsteps descend, heard him go out the front door again. He always made 2 trips. This was her moment. Ruby moved down the stairs as quickly as her body allowed. Her center of gravity had shifted with the pregnancy, and every step felt precarious. She reached the bottom and crossed the living room. The front door was open. She could see Craig's truck in the driveway, the passenger door open, his back turned as he reached for more bags. She knelt at the threshold. The gap was there, narrow, maybe half an inch. She slid the folded note through. It caught for a moment on a rough edge of the weather stripping, and she pushed it with her fingertip until it disappeared onto the porch. Then she stood and walked back upstairs. She was sitting on the bed when Craig returned with the second load. He locked the door without a word. The note sat on the porch for 2 days. The wind pushed it against the railing. Rain dampened one corner. A stray cat stepped on it Tuesday morning. By Tuesday evening, it had blown to the edge of the top step. On Wednesday night, Silas Brennan rode down Wilkerson Street. He was coming from a late run to the clubhouse, where they had spent 3 hours discussing the toy drive route for December. He slowed as he passed the blue house. He had noticed the overgrown yard before, the stuffed mailbox, the way the place seemed to exist in a permanent state of neglect. Something about it bothered him, though he could not say what. He parked his bike at the curb to adjust his glove. The engine ticked as it cooled, and in the amber light of the street lamp he saw a small white rectangle on the porch step, half soaked and trembling in the breeze. He would not have picked it up if the wind had not pushed it to the sidewalk at that exact moment. It landed near his boot, and he reached down out of reflex. He unfolded it. The ink had bled in places, but the words were legible. He read them once, then again, then a third time, standing perfectly still under the streetlight. "My name is Ruby. I am pregnant and locked in this house." Silas looked up at the house. The windows were dark on the first floor. But on the second floor, behind a thin curtain, a light was on. Faint, the kind of light that comes from a single lamp in a small room. He folded the note and put it in his vest pocket. He did not call the police. He did not knock on the door. He had spent enough years on the edges of a system that had failed him to know that a phone call to the authorities could go one of two ways, and the wrong way could get someone killed. He got back on his bike and rode to the clubhouse. Danny was still there, cleaning the bar. "I need you to call a meeting," Silas said. "Full chapter, tomorrow night." Danny looked at him. He had known Silas long enough to read the weight in his voice. "What happened?" Silas pulled the note from his pocket and laid it on the bar. Danny read it. He read it again. He set it down and looked at Silas. "What do you want to do?" "I want to get her out." Danny nodded. There was no hesitation, no question about whether this was their business, or whether it was wise, or whether the world would understand. A woman was locked in a house 3 blocks away, and she had asked for help, and the note had found its way to the one man the world said you should never trust. "I'll make the calls," Danny said. By Thursday evening, the phone tree had reached every member of the Tacoma chapter and 13 members from the neighboring Olympia chapter, 62 riders confirmed. Silas sat alone in the clubhouse after everyone had gone. He held the note under the light and read it one more time. "Please, anyone." He folded it carefully and placed it back in his vest, right over his heart, in the pocket behind the patch that the world used to define him, the patch that said what he was, the note that said who he was. Friday evening settled over Tacoma like a held breath. The sky was a bruised grey, low clouds pressing down on the rooftops, and the air smelled like rain and rust from the rail yard. At 6 o'clock, the first bikes began arriving at the clubhouse on Pacific Avenue. They came from every direction, down South Tacoma Way, along the waterfront, through the side streets of the hilltop neighborhood. One by one, then in pairs, then in groups of 5 and 6, until the parking lot was full and the overflow lined both sides of the street. Silas stood at the front of the main room. He was wearing the same vest he always wore, the same boots, the same expression that most people mistook for anger, but was something closer to resolve. Danny stood beside him. Behind them, a map of Wilson Street was taped to the wall. "I'm not going to make this complicated," Silas said. The room went quiet. 62 men, ranging in age from 23 to 58, stood shoulder to shoulder. Some held helmets. Some had their arms crossed. All of them were listening. 3 blocks from here, there's a woman locked in a house. She's pregnant. She's been there for months. She got a note out, and it found me." He paused. "I don't know her. I've never spoken to her. But she asked for help, and I'm not going to stand here and pretend that's not our problem." Rick Dutton, who had welded steel beams all day and still showed up with grease under his fingernails, spoke first. "What's the plan?" Silas pointed to the map. "The house is at 1847 Wilson. One way in the front, back door leads to a fenced yard. The man who lives there, his name is Craig Hollister. Drives a white pickup. Danny ran his name. He's got 2 prior domestic charges, both dropped." A murmur moved through the room. They knew what drop charges meant. They knew how that story ended. "We're not going there to hurt anyone," Silas continued. "We're going there to get her out. That's it. We ride in together, we park on the block, and we knock on the door. If he opens it, we tell him we're there for her. If he doesn't open it, we wait. 60 bikes on his street. He'll open it. Jimmy Ackerman, the youngest member, raised his hand. And if he calls the cops? Silas looked at him. Then the cops come, and they find a pregnant woman locked in a bedroom. That's not our problem. That's his. There were no more questions. Danny handed out positions. Who would park where? Who would cover the backyard? Who would stay with the bikes? It was organized the way the club organized everything, with the precision of men who had spent years moving together, trusting each other with their lives on open highways and blind curves. At 7:15, 60 motorcycles pulled out of the lot on Pacific Avenue and turned east toward Wilson Street. The sound was immense, a wall of noise that rattled windows and stopped pedestrians in their tracks. Cars pulled over, people came out on porches. A woman standing outside the laundromat on South 56th Street pressed her hand to her chest and just watched them pass. They rode in formation, 2 abreast, a column that stretched half a block. Silas was at the front. Danny rode beside him. Behind them, Rick and Jimmy, and behind them the rest, a rolling thunder of chrome and leather and purpose. They turned onto Wilson Street at 7:22. The bikes lined both sides of the road. Engines idled, then cut. The silence that followed was enormous, the kind of silence that has weight, that pushes against walls. Silas walked to the front door of 1847. Danny was 2 steps behind him. Behind them, 60 men stood in the street, on the sidewalk, on the overgrown lawn. Not moving, not shouting, just present. A wall of leather and intention that no one could ignore. Silas knocked on the door. 3 slow, heavy knocks. Inside, Craig Hollister had heard the motorcycles. He had gone to the front window and seen the street filled with bikes and men. His face had drained of color. He stood in the living room, not moving. Silas knocked again. Craig Hollister. His voice was calm, deep. The kind of voice that does not need to be raised to be heard. There's a woman in this house who wants to leave. We're here to make sure she can. Upstairs, Ruby heard the knock. She heard the voice. She pressed her hands to the window and looked down at the street below. 60 men, 60 motorcycles, leather vests and bearded faces and chrome gleaming under the streetlights. The same men she had watched ride past her window weeks ago, the same thunder she had listened to from her bed. Her knees buckled and she grabbed the windowsill to steady herself. Her breath came in short, ragged bursts. She pressed her palm flat against the glass. Downstairs, the door opened. Craig stood in the doorway, smaller than Silas had expected. He was wearing a t-shirt and jeans, and his eyes darted from Silas to Danny to the wall of men behind them. "I don't know what you're talking about," Craig said. His voice cracked on the last word. Silas reached into his vest pocket and held up the note. "She wrote this. It's got your address on it. We're not leaving until she walks out that door." Craig's jaw tightened. He looked past Silas at the street. 60 faces looked back at him. Not with rage, not with bloodlust, with something worse, certainty. The absolute, unshakable certainty of men who had already decided what was going to happen. Patty Ellsworth, the 72-year-old woman who lived next door, had come out on her porch when she heard the motorcycles. She had lived beside Craig for 2 years and had always thought something was wrong in that house. She had heard crying once, late at night. She had noticed that the woman who moved in had stopped appearing, but she had never been sure enough to act. Now, watching 60 men standing in the street for a woman they had never met, she picked up her phone and called the police. "I need someone at 1847 Wilson," she said, "and you need to hurry." Craig did not move from the doorway. His hand gripped the doorframe, knuckles white. He looked at Silas the way people always looked at Silas, with fear. But this time, the fear was not based on a stereotype. It was based on truth. Silas was not there to hurt him. He was there because a piece of paper with desperate handwriting had landed at his feet, and he had chosen to read it. "Step aside," Silas said. Not a threat. A fact. Craig stepped aside. Silas walked into the house. Danny followed. They climbed the stairs and found the bedroom door with the exterior deadbolt. Danny looked at it and shook his head. "A deadbolt on a bedroom door," he said quietly, "in a house with a pregnant woman." Silas turned the bolt. The door swung open. Ruby was standing in the middle of the room. She was shaking. Her hands were clasped together over her belly, and tears were running down her face without sound. She looked at Silas, this enormous man with tattoos and a leather vest, and a reputation that preceded him like a storm. And she did not see a monster. She saw the man who had picked up her note. "You came," she whispered. "We came," Silas said. "All of us." He stepped to the side and gestured toward the stairs. "The door's open. You can walk out whenever you're ready." Ruby took a breath. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. She walked past Silas, past Danny, down the stairs, through the living room where Craig stood pressed against the wall, not meeting her eyes, and out the front door. She stepped onto the porch and stopped. 60 men stood before her. Some had removed their helmets. Some nodded. None spoke. They simply stood there, the men the world called outlaws, forming a corridor of silence and safety between the house and the street. Ruby walked down the steps. Jimmy Ackerman offered her his arm to steady herself. Rick Dutton had already pulled his truck around from 2 blocks away, so she would not have to walk far. She climbed into the passenger seat and sat there, breathing, one hand on her belly, looking out at the street full of chrome and leather and men who had come because a stranger asked. Officer Tom Redding arrived 4 minutes later. He found Craig Hollister sitting on the living room floor. He found the deadbolt on the bedroom door. He found the empty room upstairs with its single lamp and its stained carpet, and its window that looked out on a street that had just witnessed something the evening news would struggle to explain. Craig Hollister was arrested that night. The story made the local news the following morning. The headline read, "Biker Gang Storms Tacoma Block in Domestic Dispute." The word gang sat in the sentence like a verdict, and Silas did not bother reading past it. He had seen enough headlines in his life to know that the truth rarely fit the font. Ruby was taken to Tacoma General Hospital, where a nurse named Karen Stowe checked her vitals and confirmed that both she and the baby were healthy. Ruby's blood pressure was elevated, and she was dehydrated, but there were no signs of physical injury beyond the kind that does not leave marks. The exhaustion of prolonged confinement, the thinness that comes from eating only what someone else decides you deserve. Karen brought her a warm blanket and a cup of tea and sat with her for 20 minutes without asking a single question. Sometimes the most important thing a person can do is simply be present. Ruby's sister, Anne, drove up from Portland the next day. She had not heard from Ruby in over 5 months. Craig had told Ruby that Anne had stopped calling. He had told Anne that Ruby had changed her number and did not want contact. The lies were simple, efficient, and devastating. When Anne walked into the hospital room and saw her sister sitting up in bed with her hands on her swollen belly, she collapsed into the chair beside the bed and cried until she could not breathe. "I thought you left," Anne said. "I thought you didn't want to talk to me anymore." "He told me the same thing about you," Ruby said. They held each other for a long time, and the room was quiet except for the beeping of monitors and the rain against the window. 3 days later, Ruby was released from the hospital. She moved into Anne's apartment in Portland temporarily while the district attorney's office built its case against Craig Hollister. The charges included unlawful imprisonment, coercive control, and reckless endangerment. Craig's attorney requested bail, which was denied. The judge cited the deadbolt on the bedroom door as evidence of premeditated confinement. The story continued to circulate in the media, and the narrative shifted as more details emerged. The initial headline about a biker gang gave way to more nuanced reporting. A local journalist named Peter Calloway wrote a long-form piece for the Tacoma News Tribune titled "The Men Behind the Patch," in which he interviewed several members of the chapter. The article revealed that the Hells Angels Tacoma chapter had organized community flood relief, annual toy drives, and informal neighborhood patrols for over a decade. It quoted Mrs. Chen, the grocery store owner, who said, "They never asked for thanks, they just showed up." The article did not make Silas a hero in the public eye. The world does not change its mind about people that quickly. Some readers commented that the bikers were just looking for attention. Others said it was a publicity stunt. A few suggested that the club was trying to clean up its image for legal reasons. People clung to their assumptions the way they always do, tightly, defensively, as if admitting they were wrong about one man meant admitting they might be wrong about everything. But something had shifted, not in the world, in the people who were there. Patty Ellsworth, the neighbor who had lived beside Craig's house for 2 years without acting, began volunteering at a domestic violence shelter in downtown Tacoma. She told the intake coordinator that she had learned something about courage from a group of men she had spent years avoiding on the sidewalk. Jimmy Ackerman, who had offered Ruby his arm on the porch steps, completed his EMT certification and was hired by the Tacoma Fire Department. On his first day, a paramedic asked him about the tattoo on his forearm, the winged skull. Jimmy told him what it meant. The paramedic nodded and said nothing more. A month later, they responded to a call together, and the paramedic told him he was glad to have him on the team. Rick Dutton continued coaching Little League. At the end of season banquet, one of the fathers, a man who had crossed the street to avoid Rick at the hardware store 2 years earlier, approached him and shook his hand. "I heard what you guys did," the father said. "On Wilson Street." Rick nodded. "We did what anyone would do," he said. But both of them knew that was not true. Not everyone would have done it. That was the point. Danny Meacham visited Ruby in Portland once, 3 weeks after the rescue. He brought a bag of baby clothes that the club members' wives and girlfriends had collected. He sat in Anne's living room and drank coffee and talked about the weather and the Seahawks and nothing of consequence. When he stood to leave, Ruby hugged him. He was stiff at first. He was not a man accustomed to being embraced by strangers, but then he put one arm around her carefully, the way you hold something that matters. "Thank you," she said. "You wrote the note," Danny said. "You did the hard part." Silas did not visit. He did not call. He did not seek recognition or contact or closure. That was not who he was. He had read the note, and he had acted, and that was the end of his involvement. He went back to the shipyard. He went back to the clubhouse. He went back to riding down Wilson Street on Thursday nights, past the blue house that now stood empty, its windows dark, its porch swept clean. But he kept the note. It stayed in the interior pocket of his vest, behind the patch, folded into a small square that he never unfolded again. He did not need to read it. He knew every word. On a cold Tuesday in December, Ruby gave birth to a healthy boy at a hospital in Portland. She named him Samuel, 7 pounds, 4 ounces, with a full head of dark hair and a cry that filled the delivery room like a declaration. Anne was there. Karen Stowe, the nurse from Tacoma, drove down for the birth on her day off. Ruby held her son against her chest and listened to his breathing and thought about all the doors that had been locked and all the doors that had been opened and the strange, impossible truth that the hands that opened the last one had belonged to a man the world told her to fear. 2 weeks after Samuel was born, Ruby wrote a letter. Not a note this time. A letter. She addressed it to the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club, Tacoma Chapter, Pacific Avenue. It was 3 pages long, handwritten, and she did not make a copy. She mailed it on a Wednesday morning. The letter arrived at the clubhouse on Friday. Danny opened it and read it aloud to the 12 men who happened to be there that evening. When he finished, the room was quiet. Rick Dutton cleared his throat. Jimmy Ackerman looked at the floor. Silas, who was sitting at the end of the bar, said nothing. He finished his beer, stood up, and walked outside. He sat on his bike in the parking lot for a long time, The air was cold and sharp, and the stars were visible for the first time in weeks. He thought about his daughter. He thought about the years he had spent being defined by a patch on his back. He thought about a folded piece of paper that had traveled from beneath a door to his boot to his vest pocket, where it still rested, worn and soft. The world would go on seeing what it wanted to see. Headlines would still say, "Gang." Strangers would still cross the street. Politicians would still use men like him as convenient villains in speeches designed to make voters feel safe. But on one street in Tacoma, on one October night, 60 men who looked like the world's worst nightmare had shown up for a woman they had never met, not because it would change how people saw them, but because it was the right thing to do. And that, Silas thought, was the only definition of character that had ever mattered. Not the patch, not the bike, not the beard or the tattoos or the reputation that followed him like a shadow, just a man, reading a note, choosing to act. He started the engine and rode home through the quiet streets of Tacoma, the sound of his motorcycle echoing off the buildings like a heartbeat, steady, unbroken, and impossible to ignore.